Well, welcome everyone. It's good to join you again for another of these discussion videos, a chance to think further about the issues we're encountering week by week in our current sermon series, Kingdom Choices. And this week we're turning our minds again to the story we talked about on Sunday, one of the most ancient and also memorable in the whole of Scripture, the tragic tale of Cain and Abel. This is another story which has worked its way into the lexicon of our wider culture. Just like headline writers turn to the story of David and Goliath, when a lesser power or figure defeats a greater one, they also summon up the memory of Cain and Abel, when sibling rivalries spill out of control. We spoke on Sunday about some examples of that. The Charlton brothers in football, the Miliband's and their battle for leadership of the Labour Party in 2010, and of course all that's gone wrong within our royal family in recent years. And I guess for many of us, such stories hold a certain fascination, perhaps because deep down we are aware of the particular tragedy of a falling out between siblings, how painfully sad it is when relationships which we might hope and expect to be stable and trusting turn out to be the opposite. And as I said on Sunday, we need to acknowledge the truly awful nature of this story of Cain and Abel. This is more than a family drama or a soap opera. This is a terrible event about violence which spirals out of control. Now, it seems to me that to properly understand this story, you need to see it in the context of where it sits in Genesis. It comes right after the account of the fall that we find in chapter 3. So we've read there of Adam and Eve's rebellion, of sin breaking into the world as a terrible consequence of what they've done. And now we're going to read of a story that demonstrates the personal and family crises that will come because of sin, relationship breakdowns which will occur because of sin. We're going to discover that sin is not some abstract concept, but it's actually a force which can take hold of people and wreak terrible havoc in the lives of others. So a brief recap of the story. It begins with us being told of these two boys, Cain and Abel, who are born to Adam and Eve. Many commentators on this text suggest that they might be twins on the basis that we're told once of Adam and Eve making love, but twice of her giving birth. That seems like a plausible reading to me, and if they are indeed twins, it only adds to the drama of what happens next. And so the boys grew up, and like many parents since time immemorial, Adam and Eve find that although they've brought them up in the same home, in the same way, they turn out differently. Cain works at agriculture, and Abel is a farmer of livestock. And then the time comes when both boys offer to God some of their produce as an offering. And this is where things really start to get complicated, because God looks with favour on what is offered by Abel, but not Cain. So this is all very intriguing. We're not told what form this favour or lack of favour took, and we're not told why one offering is deemed more acceptable than the other. Various theories have been put forward to try to explain this. Some people say that God saw something better in Abel's heart, or that the sacrifices of a living creature are more worthy of him than that of plants. But that is all conjecture. There's nothing in the passage which fills in these details. And as we were saying on Sunday, all of this raises a big question about what the point of this story is. And it seems to me that the writer is not really concerned with why this favour or lack of favour occurs, but rather how each of us deals with such situations when they inevitably arise in our lives. As we all know, lots of things happen on a daily basis which seem unfair, and for which we can't really come up with an explanation. So in what is often referred to as the lottery of life, we all find ourselves winning and losing in different ways. Some people are cleverer, more successful, better looking than others. Some seem to go through life with what seems to be a charmed existence, always landing on their feet, and others struggle. They struggle financially in spite of working hard, or they face poor health in spite of looking after their bodies. Some people earn promotion and others are overlooked. And in one way or another, there will be some moment for all of us when we find ourselves on the wrong side of those kinds of scenarios, when it's us in the position of being the unfavourite one. And when this happens, we have a choice about how to respond. We read of that choice when God speaks about it to Cain. Let me remind you of what he says. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." And in the original Hebrew, this scene is described in very vivid terms. God literally says to Cain, "Your face has fallen, but now what has fallen can be lifted up." In other words, you don't need to stay in this place of disappointment forever. And then God speaks of how the outcome of all of this is one which rests in Cain's hands. It's up to him what happens. God speaks of how sin is crouching at his door. It's a very powerful language. It speaks of the strong force sin can exert on a person. And yet God also says this force can be resisted. It is not inevitable that sin will have its way, but Cain needs to be strong in this moment. He needs to rule over sin. But sadly, we know how this story pans out. We know that Cain finds himself unable to do so. And verse 8 tells us of the two men out in the field where Cain attacks Abel and kills him. And then we move on to the end, to that well-known scene where God confronts Cain with the reality of what he has done when he appears to show no remorse for his actions. Do you remember how he dismissively asks, "Am I my brother's keeper?" As Eugene Peterson translates his phrase, "Am I his babysitter?" Uh, God has told Cain that he has to take responsibility for his actions. He has to find the willpower to resist sin. But sadly, these words back to God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" they're the words of someone who won't own what he's done. Am I responsible for this? And then the story comes to a conclusion with Cain left to spend the rest of his days as a restless wanderer. He's described as heading off to the land of Nod. To our ears, that might sound nice and cozy. We speak of drifting off to sleep as going off to the land of Nod, but the Hebrew actually means something very different. Nod is no man's land. Cain is going to live forever on the margins of society. So what are we to make of this story? How are we to respond to it? I will be the first to admit that this is a particularly challenging passage, and some of the questions it raises do not have straightforward answers. But nonetheless, I think we need to ask them. We can't shy away from the difficulty here. So our first question, one I'd encourage you to talk over with each other. How can we make the right choices in the moments when we face disappointment? As I said earlier, this story will strike a chord with many of us because it describes a situation which feels unfair, but which is also part and parcel of life. We often find ourselves disadvantaged through no fault of our own or disappointed. And that seems to be the case with Cain. For whatever reason, his sacrifice is deemed to be unacceptable to God. But that does not mean his life is doomed to disaster. God speaks of how this is a moment when he has a choice. When sin is crouching at his door, when he faces huge temptation, but he can master it. So it's a fascinating description of life in the new reality of Genesis 4, the world after the fall. Yes, sin is now a force in the world, but that does not mean people are victims who are helpless and doomed to destruction. People are still capable of doing the right thing, but they have to choose well. So you might want to talk this over. How does this fit with your own experience? Can you think of times in your life when you were faced with disappointment, but you managed to overcome that with God's help? And what might have happened if you hadn't responded in that way? How might things be different now? So why don't you take some time to hit the pause button and talk this over between yourselves. And now, a second question, and the most difficult of our three this week. Where is God in all of this? You know, when we read Genesis 4, we have to honestly acknowledge that the role played by God in this story is one of the things which makes it hard to understand. You could say that all of the trouble starts in this story because of the actions of God, because God makes a choice. He decides, for reasons which are not explained to us, that Abel's offering is more acceptable than Cain's. And this may seem unfair in our eyes, but this is the way God has willed it. And yet after this has happened, God comes alongside Cain and talks to him in what feels like the manner of a coach giving a prep talk. Come on, Cain. I know this is hard, but this setback doesn't have to be the whole story. You're downcast now, but if you do the right thing, you can find a way back from here. You can smile again. Your long face can be lifted up. And then after Cain kills Abel, God returns to the scene, but this time as the one who speaks judgment and punishment upon Cain. He has heard Abel's blood crying out to him from the ground, and he cannot ignore that. He must do something in response to that. So the picture we would have would seem to be of a God who says, you may not like all of my decisions, but you need to deal with them in the right way. And you cannot allow your anger at what I have done to be directed against others. So does that make sense to you? Or do you think there is something else going on here? Why don't you hit pause and talk this over amongst yourselves? How do we make sense of the perplexing actions of God in this story? And now one last question for discussion this week. How can we help each other as we all deal with the sort of struggles Cain faced? Again, we have to acknowledge that what Cain went through was an incredibly hard struggle, and that today some of us will find ourselves facing similar temptations. I find it telling that when Peter writes to early Christians who he is pastoring about the challenges they face, he speaks of this issue of temptation in ways which are strikingly similar to how God speaks to Cain back in Genesis. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And obviously it is hard for any of us to face these issues on our own. Times of temptation like this are when we need others alongside us, helping us to process our disappointment and to respond wisely. So can we take some time to talk this over together? How do we make sure that we're not left to deal with these problems on our own, but by getting alongside each other? And it might also be helpful to reflect together on times when others have come alongside you and helped you choose well as you worked through disappointment or unfair experiences. Maybe you could share an experience like that you've been through, and how other people helped you might be the means of helping some of you now think, well, here's how I could come alongside someone else and help them work through that. So again, for one last time, why don't you talk this over together? Well, thank you again for joining us, friends. And as our time together comes to an end, let me pray for you. Let me pray God's blessing and protection over you. So I pray, my friends, that as you go from this place back to whatever conflicts or conundrums that you are presently confronting, that you would know the presence and strength of God. Strength to resist temptation, strength to choose well, strength to love. And I pray that your face, which might be downcast now, would soon bear the smile of the one who has known the provision of the Father, the companionship of the Son, the freedom of the Spirit, a face lifted up again by God. Amen. Bye for now, friends, and I'll see you soon.